They beat my daughter and laughed like she wasn't even human. A cold night in Virginia. Evelyn, 17, lay bleeding on the pavement, handcuffed like a criminal. Her crime? Driving home late while black. That's it. But what they didn't know. Her father is Hans, a former Navy SEAL who once wiped out a terror cell without a sound. This isn't just about Evelyn anymore. This is war. What state are you in? Does evil get a handshake there, or a reckoning? Evelyn had just finished her evening class close to 11 p.m. The city of Oak Ridge at night grew quiet, especially on the east side, where no one was rich, no one was too loud, and no one ever spoke up about anything. The 17-year-old girl drove her mother's old car, recently repaired after a broken headlight. A flickering yellow light flashed at the upcoming intersection, and she gently pressed the gas, making it through just before it turned red. At that very moment, a sudden flash of red and blue lights swept in from behind. A patrol car, sirens off, sped ahead and blocked her car. Evelyn gasped. She hadn't done anything wrong. Her hands were still on the wheel, the map app still open on her phone. She rolled down the window. Two white officers, one tall and broad, the other shorter with shifty eyes, approached. They didn't greet her, didn't ask for ID. The taller one growled. "Ran a red light, huh? You think laws don't apply at night?" Evelyn replied softly, trying to stay calm. "Sir, the light was still yellow when I crossed." The other officer leaned in close, his face inches from hers. "Black kids talk back now, do they?" That moment shattered all of Evelyn's internal defenses. Her breath quickened, heart pounding. She bit her lip, barely had time to respond before the car door was yanked open. Both officers grabbed her, pulling so hard her arm nearly dislocated. "Where's your bag? Hand it over," the voice barked amidst the rustling of zippers. Evelyn gasped, tried to react, but before she could speak, her wrist was twisted backward. The cold bite of handcuffs clamped down on her skin. "Stay still. Resisting an officer, are you?" As if she had just set off a bomb. Then suddenly, a fist slammed into her left cheek. Her face hit the car door. Another blow followed, and a hand grabbed her hair, slamming her head into the pavement. Evelyn didn't scream from pain, but from not understanding what was happening. "I didn't do anything. I didn't—" She tried to cry out, but her throat was dry and raw. Her face pressed against the concrete. Her forehead throbbed. Her lips split. She smelled her own blood, hot and humiliating. They didn't stop immediately. One of the officers shouted again, "I said stop!" while the other stood back, smirking. No one intervened. No one checked if she had a weapon, if she was dangerous. They didn't need a reason. Everything had been decided the moment their headlights landed on her skin. Evelyn lay still, blood soaking into her hair. One officer sneered, "Another one. Bet she'll shut up after this." The other chuckled, "She's already quiet. Can't say anything now." They laughed like it was a joke. They didn't hide from street cams, didn't cover their faces. They knew, or believed, no one would check. A black girl beaten in a poor neighborhood at night? That story wouldn't make the news. If it did, it'd be a single line. Black teen arrested for non-compliance. Evelyn shut her eyes. She wasn't thinking of the law, of who would defend her. Just one thought floated to the surface, distant, blurry, something her father once said. "If you ever get in trouble, just survive. I'll take care of the rest." She didn't expect that day to come so soon, and she didn't know that elsewhere Hans had just woken from a half-sleep, the phone ringing at exactly 11:42 p.m. Hans couldn't remember when he dozed off. The basketball game on TV was still in the second quarter, the commentators' voices humming just low enough to lull someone into that hazy space between dream and wakefulness. His old T-shirt clung to his back with sweat, and the small house was dimly lit by the glow of the screen. Outside, the March wind was cold and dry, whispering through the backyard grass with a sound like someone murmuring. Then the phone rang. The first vibration didn't make Hans open his eyes, but the second, the third, and then the sight of the caller ID, unknown number, snapped him fully awake. In 20 years of service with the SEALs, never once had a midnight call brought good news. The instincts he'd locked away since retirement kicked in like a door blown off its hinges. He answered. A woman's voice, clear, professional, trying to stay composed. "Hello, Mr. Hands. This is Officer Mendez from Oak Ridge Police. Your daughter Evelyn was assaulted during a traffic stop. She's being treated at Memorial Hospital." Hans didn't hear the rest. Just 3 words. Was assaulted. His throat went dry. His whole body stiffened as if hit by a bullet, but still standing. No clear image formed in his mind, only a blank space. He didn't scream, didn't curse, just sat there in silence. Is she conscious?" he asked, his voice so low it didn't sound like his own. "When we arrived at the scene, she was responsive. EMTs are treating her and taking her to the hospital. You should come as soon as possible." He hung up. "No, thank you. No further questions." The next move didn't require thought. Hans stood up without switching on a light, walked the familiar path, grabbed his coat and shoved his car keys into his pocket, didn't reach for his wallet, didn't put on shoes, didn't lock the door. The house behind him was no longer a home. It had returned to its true form, a temporary shelter. The only thing he carried, as he had on every mission into a kill zone, was his breath. Short, steady, the one thing that could keep you alive when bullets were chambered. He rushed to the car, closed the door silently. The cold bit into his face, but Hans didn't feel it. The engine started on the first try, the only luck that night. On the road to the hospital, every streetlight, every turn was a blur, flashing by too quickly to matter. Hans didn't count how many red lights he ran, how many cars he forced to swerve. He didn't care if he got pulled over. The police had beaten his daughter. What else was there to be polite for? Only when he turned onto Maple Street, where EMTs had set up a temporary station, did he let one hand off the wheel. That hand clenched into a trembling fist, shaking not from fear but from restraint. Yet his eyes were dry. No tears, no panic. Just one thought ringing louder than any siren, louder than any voice. They touched Evelyn, and they think I hung up my badge on a wall when it's in my blood. Hans made a sharp turn at the corner. The car was still trembling from the braking force when he flung the door open and jumped out, every movement driven by survival instinct. Police tape cordoned off both ends of the intersection, but no one could stop a man whose gaze was as sharp as a blade freshly honed. No uniform, no badge, no questions, no need to prove identity. Just a gait that didn't stray an inch, a back straight like when carrying a tactical pack, and a stare fixed like a rifle's sights that was enough for every on-duty officer to instinctively step aside. Hans didn't shout his daughter's name. He didn't cry out or lose composure, but every one of his steps pounded like a death knell, straight into the minds of those present. Evelyn lay on a stretcher, temporarily placed under a street lamp as the ambulance parked in reverse at the end of the block. Her small body was covered with a thin blanket, but her face, Hans nearly didn't recognize her. The left cheek was bruised all the way to the temple. Her right eye was swollen shut. The corner of her mouth split open, with streaks of dried blood forming jagged lines across her brown skin. Skin, just yesterday still smiling at him through the kitchen window, now looked like a map of violence. Her hand was roughly bandaged. Her wrist bore deep marks from cuffs, not like metal restraints, but as if someone had yanked a chain around her arm. Her hair was a mess. The neat braids Shirley had done over the weekend undone, tangled with blood and dirt. Just like the image of this girl, an ordinary daughter, turned into a target. Hans slowed down. He could hear his own breathing, heavy like the days he wore an oxygen tank diving underwater. He didn't feel the cold, even though the March wind was lashing against his neck. Every other sense was drowned by something else, a cold, dizzying anger. Not the usual kind, but the quiet, smoldering type seen on battlefields, when you find a comrade's body after an ambush. "Evelyn?" His voice came out so soft it was barely audible, like saying it any louder might shatter everything. His hand touched hers, and instantly he felt a cold that no child should carry after the first spring of their life. She tried to open her eyes. One eyelid stayed shut, but the other, even just a narrow slit, was enough to see her father's face. No one else mattered enough for her to use the last of her strength to look at. Her lips trembled slightly, and from her dry throat came a few broken words. They laughed. Dad, they laugh. Hans squeezed her hand gently, almost unconsciously, part to assure her he was there, part to hold himself back from making any sound. He'd read hundreds of torture reports, witnessed the aftermath of countless wars, but he had never seen a battered body that made him unable to feel rage right away, only choking silence. Evelyn 17 had her youth ripped away by fists and the laughter of those paid to protect, and they did it like it was just another day. They had no idea they'd picked the wrong target, wrong person, wrong night, wrong family. And Hans, though he hadn't said a word, had already begun counting backwards in his head, from the phone call at 11:42 to the moment he would come face to face with every individual connected to that night. Evelyn didn't say much. No one asked her to. Her body had spoken. Every bruise, every scrape, every swelling was like misquoted excerpts from an official report no one bothered to write. Hans sat there, eyes fixed on her, while the EMTs worked quietly around her. One of them, a brown-skinned woman with a closed but not cold expression, turned to glance at him for a moment. She nodded, very slightly. That gesture might mean nothing to most, but Hans understood. It was the only way she could confirm. Everything you're thinking is true. There's no report that records the smell of fresh blood, no camera that captures the look in a 17-year-old girl's eyes when she's punched on the street. But Hans didn't need any of that to know the truth. He only needed Evelyn's broken breathing, her fingers curling from pain, and the muffled whimpers behind her lips. Every sound, every movement, every glance was being logged in his mind like internal footage, not for sentiment, for action. When the ambulance doors closed, Hans stepped in behind. No one stopped him, not because they knew who he was, but because no one could stand in that man's way at that moment. He sat in the seat beside her, buckled the belt like a programmed reflex, and gently took Evelyn's left hand. It was small, swollen. He touched her so lightly it was barely contact, but still enough for her to feel a point of support, however small, in the chaos. They said, "I resisted arrest." Her voice was like torn paper caught in the wind. "I didn't do anything. I followed the rules. But when I cried out, they hit harder." Hans didn't press, didn't ask for more, didn't need details because it was already clear. The way Evelyn whispered, the way she still tried to choose the right words as if she had to prove her innocence. That was the most brutal part. Hans squeezed her hand again, not to reassure, but to say, without speaking, "I know, I hear you, I forget nothing." This wasn't tender sympathy. This was the kind of attention only known by those who've survived battlefields when no one speaks, but everything is recorded at the deepest level. And Hans was recording every breath, every blood-stained testimony to do something with it. From that moment, Hans knew he was no longer the man he thought he'd become. No longer the retired vet tending his backyard, no longer the stay-at-home dad doing school runs, no longer someone who accepted that justice was someone else's job. Again, he felt his body shift, heartbeat steady, breath deeper, thoughts sharpening like a blade unsheathed. His old unit had a name for this, action mode. But this time, there was no terrain map, no guerrilla fighters, no enemy with a clear face. This time, the target was a system that knew the law and still laughed while breaking it. Hans didn't need to shout, didn't need to point fingers, didn't need a movie speech. He only needed one sentence in his mind, and it was enough to shake the very foundation of the system that once stood proud. They didn't just hit my daughter, they picked the wrong person to do it to. 2 days after the incident, before dawn had fully broken and with a thin layer of mist still clinging to the street, Hans stood in front of the Oak Ridge Police Department headquarters. He wore a dark shirt, a simple khaki jacket. In his hand was a hard folder containing a formal complaint, a medical confirmation, a copy of the intersection footage, and a one-page summary of the incident. Not a word was wasted. The closing line, "I am requesting the full case file, video recordings, and the identities of the 3 officers present at the scene on the night of the 14th. If there is no response within 72 hours, I will submit this complaint to the State Department of Justice and national media outlets." Hans pushed the door open. The reception desk was quiet. Behind it, a sergeant was finishing his morning coffee. When Hans approached, the man looked up, not out of fear, just habit. Some people enter like they need help. Hans entered like he was here to offer help or hold someone accountable. I'm here to file a complaint regarding the excessive use of force by 3 police officers during a traffic stop on the night of the 14th. The victim is my daughter, Hans said, clear and exact. The sergeant took the folder, glanced at the header, asked nothing, requested no ID, just said, "Someone will call you." Hans didn't move. "I also want to request access to the body cam footage of those 3 officers. The sergeant hesitated slightly. "That has to go through internal affairs, 3rd floor." The stairs were old. The railing was chipped. Hans climbed slowly, each step as steady as his breath. Outside internal affairs was a dull aluminum sign, Office of Internal Investigations. Authorized personnel only. He knocked twice. Firm, but not aggressive. A voice inside called, "Come in." Keller sat behind the desk. Balding, light blue shirt, tie stained with old coffee. He stood and shook Hans's hand, firm but uncertain, as if unsure whether Hans was an angry civilian or a key witness. "I'm Keller. I handle internal record requests." Hans placed his file on the desk. Keller skimmed it, nodded. "I understand your situation. I'm sorry. But according to the tech department, the body cams from that shift had technical failures." Hans didn't raise an eyebrow or speak. He stared at Keller for a few seconds before asking, "All of them?" "Yes," Keller replied, avoiding his gaze. "All 3 devices malfunctioned during the incident. We're still reviewing it, but there are no usable recordings. 3 officers, 3 cameras. All failed the same night. That's quite the coincidence," Hans said, slowly, evenly, like counting trigger pulls. Keller gave a thin smile, trying to shift back to small talk. "You know how technology is. Glitches happen." Hans stood, nodded. "Thank you." He said nothing more. He didn't need to. Every pause, every evasion, every tight-lipped response from Keller was familiar. Hans had seen it in the Middle East, where officials filed missing reports after insurgents were accidentally interrogated. He had seen it in East African interrogation rooms, where key testimony always went missing at the most convenient moment. He left the room feeling like he had exited a space suffocating, not from lack of air, but from the absence of truth. And that meant the real fight began here. On the way out, Hans didn't scan his surroundings. He knew the rule, never appear too alert in a place where every eye is trained to detect alertness. But as he stepped off the last stair, something, neither sound nor movement but pure instinct, made him pause. At the corner near the security checkpoint, a young officer stood leaning casually on the metal railing, his uniform still crisp, insignia bright, sidearm properly holstered. But his eyes were not young. He looked at Hans. No blink, no pretense. It was the look of someone who had read Hans's file and already knew the ending to a story Hans hadn't yet written. When their eyes met, the officer didn't flinch or look away. Instead, he gave a faint smile, not mocking, not friendly, a smile of someone who knew there are rules, but there are also shortcuts. Then he turned and walked slowly down the corridor as if nothing needed hiding, leaving behind a sharp silence. Hans didn't follow, didn't ask. He stood still, hand in his pocket, fingers touching the small USB tucked inside the lining of his pants. It was all he had secured after 3 calls, 1 secret message, and a silent handshake beneath City Hall's parking lot from an old colleague who had helped him set up Oak Ridge's traffic surveillance system. That man, after handing over the video from the intersection on the 14th, said only one thing: "If you're planning to go big with this, you should know that here, internal, doesn't investigate internal." Hans had always known, but hearing it again from someone who'd stood with him after the chaos of a post-election Middle Eastern city gave the words a new weight. He left headquarters, carrying the USB like an unloaded gun, blurry, no clear faces, but enough to confirm one truth. Evelyn didn't run the red light. She did nothing wrong, which meant every report was a lie. Hans reached his car, opened the door, and sat behind the wheel. He didn't start the engine, didn't call anyone, just sat, letting the silence wrap around him like old camouflage from special ops days. His eyes closed, not to rest, to focus, steady breath, one at a time, like practicing sniper fire in freezing wind. No tremor, no rage, no misfire. On the battlefield, sometimes the enemy wears the same uniform, speaks the same language, but betrayed by their actions. Hans had lost a friend once for trusting an internal ally. Now no one needed to tell him in Oak Ridge the enemy didn't wear masks. They wore name tags, carried legal weapons, filed reports in Times New Roman 12, and worst of all, they weren't afraid. Hans opened his eyes. There was no anger left, only calculation. The board was set. The pieces are exposed. The question wasn't what to do, it was how to do it so no one could clean up the aftermath for them ever again. Because in this city, Evelyn wasn't the first. But as long as Hans was alive, she would be the last. Hans didn't drive home after the morning at the police station. Instead, he followed old roads winding through the back of the abandoned industrial park, along the narrow pass behind the old water park that no one had visited since the pandemic. These weren't roads familiar to ordinary people, but they were second nature to anyone trained in tactical operations, like Hans and his former teammate. Every turn, every roadside bush, every blind spot with no cameras returned to him like the layout of vital organs in memory. Routes were once used to simulate abductions, hostage rescues, and personnel extractions. No one knew they still lived in Hans's mind except Hans. His left hand grazed the dashboard, brushing over buttons like a ritual check before deployment. It was a civilian vehicle. There was no mission from the Department of Defense anymore, but he wasn't looking for music or ACHE was reaching for something deeper. Control. That ingrained feeling of holding a situation by the throat, of seeing 9 escape routes, 6 kill zones, and 3 contingencies within seconds. That afternoon, the sky was overcast. The light filtering through the windows of the old storage shed was a pale gray. Hans unlocked the door, dragging it open with a rusty screech. He didn't turn on the lights. In the dark, he knew what he was looking for. A brown-gray tarp lay in the farthest corner, beneath 3 layers of thin blankets. He pulled it aside. The oak chest underneath came into the kind custom-built for those who never expected to open it again. Inside, everything was untouched. A unit-issued combat Daguerreotype serial number faded, but the handle was still engraved with SEAL Team. A black notebook, a diary, but filled with codes, coordinates, contact signals, and names that couldn't exist in digital systems. And finally, a military wristwatch with a heavy, thick titanium casing, scratched right where Hans once slammed into a metal table, dodging mortar fire in Nigeria. He flipped the cover. The hands still ticked. After all those years, the one thing that still worked flawlessly was the thing that once helped him count the seconds between life and death. Hans stood up and walked to the small work desk near the door, opening a drawer. Inside was an old phone, active SIM, no synced contacts. He powered it on. 1 signal bar. Enough? He dialed. No contact name, just digits entered by memory. The call picked up after 2 rings. No greeting, just a deep male voice, rough like an engine idling low. "She dead?" Hans replied, tone flat and clipped, like a command. "Not yet. But someone will be." A pause, then a breath. "Been a while since you called like this." "It's been a while since my kid got beaten in the street," Hans answered. No anger, no volume, but in those words was something no one had ever heard from him. Raw exposure. The voice lowered. "What do you need?" "Intel, gear, and someone like you, for 7 days only." The line went silent for a beat. Then came the answer. "Hort, clean. Send the coordinates. I'm coming." Hans hung up. Nothing more needed to be said. People like them didn't repeat themselves. No pledges, 1 call, 1 objective, 1 unspoken promise. That night, Hans didn't sleep, not because he couldn't, but because he wouldn't allow himself to. When people still have faith in the system, they can afford to rest, telling themselves they'll fight tomorrow. But Hans had no such illusions, and he knew, if he didn't act now, tomorrow would be the day evidence disappeared, witnesses went silent, and crimes were rewritten as standard procedure. He opened the garage behind his house, a space once used for car repairs, welding panels, replacing spark plugs, or simply being alone. Now it was a new war room. No flag, no uniform, but there were targets, plans, and clear enemies. Hans dragged a sheet of plywood into the center of the room. A whiteboard once used to teach Evelyn geometric diagrams was now repurposed, turned sideways. With a marker, he drew 3 columns: name, behavior, connection. Each name would lead to a report, each behavior to a pattern, and each connection a link in a system that needed to be dismantled by hand, piece by piece. In the center of the board, he wrote in large, underlined red letters, Agenda, Expose, No warnings, no negative. In the left corner of the room stood a plastic container full of gear, no longer a toolbox. Inside were industrial zip ties, blood-resistant gloves, button-sized spy cameras, mini voice recorders, GPS trackers, and a black book, not a journal, but a compilation of techniques, psychological models, and interrogation strategies passed down among the most elite SEAL units. And now it was open again, in Oak Ridge. Hans sat down, his back against the mildewed concrete wall, pen in his right hand, lighter in his left hand. On his knee was a printed document from the police station that morning. Incident report, resisting law enforcement, suspect, Evelyn M. He set it aflame without a second thought. The page turned to ash in 10 seconds. The smell of scorched ink filled the garage like gunpowder. No need to keep it. It was fiction. Just like his patience for the system, now reduced to smoke. Hans wasn't a cop. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't here to request compensation, apologies, or impartial investigations. And he certainly wasn't a forgiving father. What his daughter went through no longer belonged to the realm of petitions and appeals. It was a scar etched into the flesh of a girl not yet 18 and rewritten as text, files, and lies. All his life, Hans had been trained to read a situation, measure the distance between the target and the exit, assess a subject in 3 seconds, and end an operation without a single shot fired. Skills he thought had been shelved, but in truth, they had only been waiting to be reactivated. This was the moment. They thought he was just a father, a man who would knock politely, fill out forms, and beg the system to police itself. But what they didn't know was that he had once been trained to dismantle an entire organization in 7 days without ever pulling a trigger. Hans chose the diner at the end of the Lexington intersection for a simple reason: no cameras, no familiar faces, and no one curious. The place existed like a blind spot in the city, unlisted in any patrol dispatch map. 3 tables were occupied, mostly truckers and night shift workers. Soft background music played, the voice of an old female singer from the 70s drifting in, as if meant only for those used to hearing it. He took the back booth, his back to the wall. From there he could see both the front and side exits, and the reflection of the parking lot in the chrome behind the coffee bar. It wasn't a seat for relaxing, it was for calculating threat angles and fallback routes. He arrived 10 minutes early and ordered 2 black coffees. Not for the caffeine, but out of habit. Always have a second cup for yourself, or for whoever might show up. The man entered exactly on time. Not early, not late. A faded khaki jacket, baseball cap pulled low, gait loose like someone tired from a shift, but the eyes said otherwise. Theo's eyes hadn't changed. Sharp, alert, scanning the whole room before stepping fully inside. No signals were exchanged. 1 second of eye contact is enough. Theo sat down without greeting or handshake, just pulled the coffee closer. "Last time we worked together," Theo said, "was when those dumbass Italians drove straight into the training camp in Idlib." Hans nodded. "That time had a lawyer. Not this time." "No." Silence. 4 seconds. No one counted, but both men felt it was the point where all assumptions collapse and reassemble. "How much time?" Theo asked. 7 days, Hans replied without pause. "Max. After that, the public camera footage is wiped. PD's evidence system only holds temporary data. Everything gets cleaned. Theo nodded and pulled a hard-bound, worn notebook from his coat. He flipped to a blank page and started writing. Need internal network access point. Wireless surveillance devices. Temporary login or server room layout. IT admin's ID. And shift schedule for tech staff. Hans slid a brown envelope across the table. Internal blueprint, updated last year, annotated by Shirley. Theo raised an eyebrow. Still in touch with her? Never lost it. The admin, Daniel Fry. Takes smoke breaks 1:30 to 2:10 a.m., usually alone in the basement. Has credit card debt. Theo gave a faint laugh. So, we don't need the front door anymore. Hans didn't laugh. Didn't reply, but something shifted in his eyes, not relief, but confirmation. The first gear had turned. Firewall? Hans asked. Outdated Windows Server 2012, patchwork config, no proper VLANs. We can get in and out undetected. Under the table, Hans tightened his grip, like testing a detonator. They don't know where we are. And won't, Theo said, not until it's too late. No one in the diner heard that exchange. To outsiders, it was just two old men reminiscing, but beneath the surface, it was a mission ignition, a handshake with no cameras, a verdict signed in silence. And in 7 days, everything would either be exposed or erased forever. They rented a small abandoned office in the East Industrial Zone. Once a freight depot, now just cold rooms, peeling plaster, and flickering lights no one bothered replacing, which made it perfect. No traffic, no eyes. Power still ran, industrial cables still connected, and it was far enough from downtown to avoid scrutiny, close enough to breach the city's internal systems within just 2 security nodes. Hans handled logistics, blacked out windows, rewired circuits, set up an isolated power grid. Theo brought tech. 2 27-inch monitors, a backup server with standalone drives, 3 corner-mounted cameras, and 2 network lines. One through an anonymous VPN, one internal for bait testing before real penetration. In 8 hours, the empty room became a digital trench, a counter-strike station where every decision felt like field ops. No one spoke on day 1. Hans set up a whiteboard on the right wall, sketching Oak Ridge PD's system layout using Shirley's old data. Theo rebuilt access logic for each internal user, a digital map of who was viewing, storing, or deleting what. Patrol logs, e-notes, body cam directories, device reports, and file edits all extracted. Anyone who thought the system was a fortress had never met Theo, who moved like a bomb tech, patient, precise, never flinching. Day 2 confirmed Hans's suspicions. Nearly every body cam from the night of the 14th went sudden disconnect during Evelyn's assault window. Yet at 2 other intersections, public cameras functioned fine. Not a system-wide failure, a targeted one. Theo found a patch folder, created 18 minutes post-incident, containing code-altering timestamps. Someone had already entered the system and erased logs before Hans could file a complaint. Hans said nothing. He studied the code, the trace chart, and then circled a name on the system diagram in red. Fry, IT admin. Beside it, the cleaner. But who gave the order? Day 3, a pattern emerged. In reports involving body cam malfunction and suspect resistance, 2 names surfaced repeatedly: R. Carlson and M. Brenner. Both had prior complaints, all withdrawn. Both used identical report phrasing. Subject responded with elevated noncompliance. Both had attended an internal training 6 months ago, the same one Shirley described as a force enhancement program that was actually a reshuffling of officers praised for effective stress incident handling. Day 4, at 2:45 a.m. Theo unearthed a video fragment buried in the server's cache, not fully overwritten. It wasn't clear, but one officer's voice came through. Just write it like always. I'll handle the rest. Hans didn't need voice ID. He stood, walked to the board, and taped up 2 photos. Carlson buzz cut, cold stare. Brenner broad face, clenched jaw. Below both, Hans wrote in red, the starting point, 3 days left. Not just to expose, but to strip away every mask they wore as a badge. Not to plead, not to elicit sympathy, but to ensure the men who laughed over his daughter's blood would learn one final lesson. That laugh was the last they'll ever get away with. It was early Thursday morning, in the back room of a counter-surveillance station deep inside an industrial zone. The only thing keeping the space from being swallowed whole by darkness was the flickering light of 2 blue screens. Theo hadn't left his chair for 8 straight hours, his back slightly hunched, fingers typing at a steady pace. Like a ticking countdown. Hans stood leaning against the wall, holding a cup of cold coffee, eyes locked on the screen. Neither of them spoke. There was no need. From the very beginning, they had understood. If something needed explaining, it wasn't yet clear enough to act on. There's a file segment that wasn't indexed, Theo said quietly, as if afraid louder words might make it disappear. It's not in the main directory, but it's in the buffer data that exists when an upload is interrupted or manipulated midway. He typed a few quick commands. The interface shifted. The screen flickered. A dialog box appeared. Final note, no metadata, and no user ID recorded. But in the bottom corner, one line stood out. Camera 2, Prospect and 9th intersection, 22:13 p.m. 14. Hans leaned in slightly, eyes unblinking. The footage loaded slowly, blurry, light distorted by car headlights. Still clear enough to see a sedan stopped. Inside, a young girl rolled down her window. She leaned forward, reaching for the glove compartment. 2 officers approached. One on the left, one behind the side mirror. Evelyn, no doubt. That face, even partially shown, was too familiar for Hans to mistake. She was pulling out her wallet. Every movement is clear, calm, not rushed, not erratic. Then, an arm swung in, from the right, fast. Sharp. The blow landed straight on her face, no warning, no signal to stop, no threatening motion from the girl. Hans stopped breathing. His grip tightened around the coffee cup until it made a faint crack. The video had no sound, but it didn't need it. The visuals said everything. The jolt of her body, her head slumping forward, arms dropping to her seat, eyes wide open, then obscured by the glare of the headlights behind. There was nothing staged, no reenactment, just a strike brutal, sudden, and unprovoked. Zio froze the frame, slowed it down, and annotated the timeline. Confirmed. Strike occurred before she finished retrieving her papers. No evasive movement, no sign of resistance. He didn't look at Hans. He didn't need to. What was needed was now visible. What needed facing was now sitting on the desk. Hans didn't reply. He stood silent for a few seconds, then set his cup down and pulled a black USB drive from his backpack. He plugged it into the side of the screen. Download it. Apply SHA-256 hash, make 3 copies, split them, A/B/C, 1 to the private drive, 1 to the VP and backup node, and 1 to Shirley. His voice wasn't raised, wasn't sharp, but every syllable hit like an order issued from a war zone, where every mistake was measured in blood. Theo complied. He didn't ask why 3, didn't ask who Shirley was. They had worked like this before, in operations where, if things failed, no one would know their names. No one would know they ever existed. This was the same. Evelyn only lived if the evidence stayed intact, and if they were going to fight, they'd fight with the one thing that couldn't be bent with words. Raw data. Hans stared at the screen one last time. His daughter's face caught in the blurred light, head tilted, lips pressed, not crying. No tears in that video. Just silence and a wound, a grainy clip, less than 18 seconds long, but enough to shatter everything the lying system had written. And from this moment forward, this wasn't about justice. It was about liberating the truth from the hands of those who thought they could delete it with a single keystroke. After saving the footage, Theo collapsed into his chair, hands pressed to his forehead like he was trying to force an answer out of his skull. The screen still held the frozen frame of Evelyn leaning sideways, her hair catching the light. A young face, pushed into a reality no 17-year-old should ever endure. Theo shook his head, voice low. half angry, half bitter. Why is it still here? They wiped everything almost perfectly. How did this get missed? Hans didn't answer right away. He stood, turned to the whiteboard where Carlson's photo sat in the center, expression blank, eyes shallow, mouth curled in that smug half-smile. The yellow light cast a shadow that made him look like a man who knew he could break the rules and never be caught. Because it wasn't in the main system, Hans replied. It's a temp file kind of generated before formal saving. If no one clears the buffer properly, it stays in the memory's lower tier. They weren't good enough. Or they didn't think anyone would dig this deep. A tech slip, Theo repeated, a sad smile forming. Just a small one, enough to overturn the whole truth. Hans shook his head. Not a slip, a gap. And whoever leaves a gap in the system will leave one somewhere else. He moved back to the desk, opened his personal laptop, device isolated from all official systems, used for one task only, preservation. He typed his two-factor password, entered a unique character string. The screen lit up with encrypted layer. Verified. He dragged the video into the fragmentation protocol. Every frame, every byte, every image would now be sliced, encrypted, and routed through 3 VPNs to offshore storage. Not stored in one place, not traceable, and, most importantly, second chances for a technical error. Theo stood, switched on the air extractor. He glanced at the wall clock, nearly 4:00 IAM. From now on, they'll know someone is tracing the breach, he said, not as a warning, but a confirmation. They'll assume it's internal, Hans replied, eyes still on the screen's progress bar. An officer who went too far, a disgruntled mole, an IT guy with a conscience. And if not? Theo asked, already knowing the answer. Then they'll pay. Hans looked up at the frozen image of Evelyn being struck. Headlight glare caught her cheek, face steady, eyes dry, no tears. Just shock, silence, and a question that no law would ever answer. And when a system knows it's about to be exposed, it doesn't fix itself. It kills the one who knows. Silence fell again. In that small room, the fan's soft hum was the only sound, like artificial breathing keeping the space from collapsing. Theo walked over to the whiteboard, drew a red line under Fry's, the IT guy, who had altered the log. Stan added an arrow pointing to Carlson. A network was forming, not a few bad actors. A structure, a chain, a machine with someone at the top, someone to cover the tracks, and someone to strike when the system sensed danger. A blurry video, less than 18 seconds, but it was the one thing the entire system hadn't accounted for. Not because it didn't matter, but because they believed no one would be patient enough, skilled enough, or driven enough to dig this deep. But they were wrong, and from the moment that footage appeared, the story changed. It was no longer about who did what, but about what they would do next. To silence the people uncovering the truth, one buried piece at a time. Friday morning, Hans hadn't slept. His eyes were bloodshot, but his focus was razor-sharp. Theo had nearly collapsed onto the table several times, but each time his head tilted, his hands remained on the keyboard. Everything in their makeshift war room had converged on one point. Evelyn's video was irrefutable. Living proof. But one piece of evidence wasn't enough. A single excuse of personal misconduct, a well-timed media chokehold, a superficial internal review, and it would all be over. Hans knew this. He'd seen it in Afghanistan, in Nigeria, in places where reports mattered more than lives. If he wanted to take down the whole machine, he had to prove it wasn't an accident, was protocol. At 5:16 a.m., Theo typed the first lines of code. An automated script was set to filter old metadata, not by names or case numbers, but by language. They entered keywords: body cam offline, system malfunction, non-compliant subject, device lost connection, signal failure in A4 zone, recorded assault on officer. All were phrases repeated in Evelyn's case report. No spelling errors, not overly direct, but repeated too perfectly as if someone had copied them straight from a template. When the script finished, Theo looked up. The results: 17 incidents. Same region, same phrasing, same procedure. Among them, 9 with no footage due to camera malfunction, 6 with allegations of excessive force, later dismissed for lack of witnesses, and 2 serious hospitalization-level injuries, where charges were withdrawn within 48 hours due to family pressure. No news cover, no records escalated beyond the Oak Ridge Police Department. Everything was contained. Hans sat down, silent. He stared at the list. 17 people. All were people of color. 13 were young black men between the ages of 17 and 25, the kind most easily labeled as dangerous or non-compliant, the kind with no one behind them. All 17 reports were signed by just 4 officers, and in 11 of them, over and the same 2 names appeared, Carlson and Brenner. Hans picked up a pen, moved to the whiteboard, and began drawing connections between cases. Lines connecting cases to names, locations to timestamps, arrest reasons to the moments cameras went dark. It formed a dense web. But at the center was no spider, was an organization with a legal badge. Hans paused over one report, identical wording, subject displayed threatening posture, uncooperative behavior. Word for word from Evelyn's file. He checked the date. One was 3 months before Evelyn's incident, another 6 weeks, one more just 7 days earlier. 1 case is violence, 2 is a coincidence. But 17? Same language, same rationale, same location, same officers? That's no random misconduct. That's a pattern. That's a system. That's an organization. Hans set the pen down and wrote beneath the diagram in block letters, "Not individual." And just below that, in smaller print, like a note to himself, to take it down, you don't strike the people, you strike the way it runs. Theo reopened temporary backup caches. Fragments missed, not yet overridden. Under the flickering screen light, he rewound, bit by bit, like brushing away layers of dust from a long-buried journal. Then a video appeared, not as clear as Evelyn's, distorted lighting, enough to see a young black man dragged from a car at night. 2 officers, tall, 1 short, approached. One pinned the man against the hood. The other opened the trunk and rummaged through it. No weapon, no aggression from the victim. The young man trembled, reflexively offering his wallet. The shorter officer reached in and pulled out a wad of cash. No report, no body cam, no footage except this leaked fragment. The image shook, then cut out. "They didn't just beat people," Theo murmured, eyes locked on the screen. This time, his voice didn't carry the shock of earlier days, but a quiet fury accumulated through years of witnessing, documenting, never allowed to fight back. "They stole." Hans nodded, pulling up the city map on his laptop, layering it with administrative data and surveillance camera placement. He circled intersections logged as signal lost. The map lit up with red dots. Then the dots started to cluster, disturbingly, unmistakably. Black neighborhoods, unlit parks, corners where cameras were tilted, no houses nearby. "They didn't pick victims," Hans said. "They picked locations. They know exactly where no one will watch, where people won't sue, and most of all, where silence has already been institutionalized." He glanced at the victim list, name, age, condition, scenario, and then the final line in each file, insufficient evidence for prosecution. Not because they hadn't been attacked, not because they hadn't spoken, but because they were assaulted by people who knew exactly when the cameras went dark, when the mics went silent, and when the system would rewrite their screams as by protocol. Hans stood, picked up a red marker, and wrote across the board in bold letters, "This is a system." He didn't need to say a word to Theo. They both understood. This wasn't about Carlson. It wasn't about Brenner. It wasn't about Fry. This was a model, an operational mechanism cloaked in badges, permits, procedure, and bureaucratic language. Every false report was a uniform. Every disabled camera has a mask. Every withdrawn complaint was the system saving itself through the victim's silence. Hans sat down, leaning on the desk, eyes fixed on the distorted, recovered footage. Every victim caught in the same pose, pinned, struck, robbed, and then erased. But Evelyn was different, not because she was special, but this time someone didn't stay silent. Someone knew how to make data permanent, how to turn every log, every pixel, every discarded file into living proof. The truth this time didn't come from someone screaming in the streets. It came from someone with a mouse, a keyboard, rebuilding what no one thought would be seen. And if Hans hadn't stepped in at the right moment, Evelyn would have become just another line in a templated report. Non-compliant subject, force used within protocol, no further response. But this time there was a response, and it was the kind the system that had never been trained to handle. Structured truth, protected, replicated, and waiting for the moment it would rip every mask away. Shirley lived in an old single-story house tucked between rows of run-down homes in South Oak Ridge. Barred windows, rusted tin roof, a brick-paved yard overgrown with weeds. The house stood not for comfort or property value, but like a quiet act of defiance in a city trying to reshape itself. Shirley could have left. Her son, now settled in Ohio, sent her plane tickets every holiday. Her daughter begged her to move to Florida. Sun, sea, peace. But she stayed, didn't sell, didn't let go. Not because she had nothing left to lose, but because there was too much she'd witnessed that no one else dared to name. Hans arrived near noon, overcast skies, a light breeze. Shirley was pruning bougainvillea near the porch, gloves stained with soil. Without turning, she spoke evenly, as if she'd known every step before it happened. "You're a day later than I expected." Hans said nothing, gave a quiet nod. "I came to you because I can't move forward without the original layout," he said. Shirley stood upright, pulled off her gloves, leaned on her knee and turned to face him. Her face bore deep lines, not from age, but from years of holding back truths unsaid. "You're not here to sue them. You're here to break them." Hans didn't flinch. "I'm here to end what should have been ended 20 years ago." She led him inside, no pleasantries, no tea offered. But everything in the house was clean, neat, and orderly, as if always ready for someone to come asking. From a drawer, she pulled out a battered tin box and retrieved a large blueprint laminated in plastic. "Internal structure of Oak Ridge PD, 2019, she said, laying it on the table like evidence at a trial. Each branch was color-coded. Red field ops, the boots on the ground, green logistics and tech, and gray, she tapped her pen on several gray-capped names, those not in any division but with access to the entire flow of information. They don't just see it, they can alter it. These people don't work alone. They work within a design." Hans studied every name. Some he recognized from reports. Others had never shown up on any official record. The most disturbing were the ones with no departmental title, standing in the gaps, responsible for neither action nor oversight. Yet every piece of information had to pass through them. Shirley looked him in the eye, her voice quiet but sharp. "If you want to bring down this tree, don't cut the branches. Break the root axis." Hans nodded. He didn't ask how she still had this document, or why she kept it, or why she was giving it to him now. He already knew. Some people don't resist by shouting or filing reports. They resist by remembering, by refusing to forget, by staying, even when the city has no place left for them. Shirley didn't stay in Oak Ridge because she had no way out. She stayed because if she left, no one would remain to hold on to the map now lying on the table. And without someone keeping that map, no one would realize the system they thought was random had been engineered all along, not for transparency, but for something never written into any policy: the creation of an untouchable circle of violence and cover-up protected by legitimate authority. Shirley wasn't an outsider. She wasn't a witness, not a victim, not a bystander. She had been inside the system, not at the edges, at its core. As the lead investigator for personnel files, she had read every internal report, every complaint withdrawn, every transfer order signed in the dead of night. She'd seen names like Carlson, Brenner, and Fry back when they were just rookies, and watched them rise into positions where they could act without ever having to answer. She knew the system didn't break all at once. It corroded, one gear at a time, one misnamed incident at a time, until the whole machine turned, and no one dared say it had changed direction. She had tried to fix it, with memos, by keeping original files in a locked drawer, with honest conversations in hallways. But she'd also gone quiet. Back then, she still had ties. 2 kids in school, a husband dying of late-stage cancer, and more than anything, she once believed it could be fixed from within, until the day Hans's wife, her best friend, died after a buried investigation. Shirley never got official proof, but she saw how the file disappeared hours before the hearing, saw how the judge had once served on the same disciplinary board as her husband, and she understood this wasn't a system in need of reform, it was a structure designed to conceal. After that, Shirley withdrew from every position. No public statement, no protest, but she never joined another meeting, never signed another report. "I didn't betray the system," she told Hans when he brought it up. "I just stopped helping it hide." Hans listened, didn't interrupt. People like Shirley didn't need others to confirm they were right. They needed someone silent enough to hear it through and calm enough to act when the time came. From a drawer, she brought out a new internal diagram, unofficial, unstamped but precise to the detail. Who was now in charge of the Rapid Response Unit? Who vetted scene investigation reports? Who handled camera footage after each technical incident? "I don't have access anymore," she said, "but I remember everything. Who cleans whose reports, whose cases were shelved, who always got reassigned right before a scandal broke." Theo, after reviewing the map, said just one sentence: "We need a remote monitor, if you're still willing to stay in the shadows." Shirley smiled and slowly poured more tea. "I never left the shadows. This time, I just want them to lead somewhere." Hans left Shirley's house an hour later. The sky was still gray, the wind still light, but his steps were heavier, not from pressure, but because for the first time he held something the system never expected: a living map, a memory with structure. Someone who once helped build the system and now wanted to dismantle it from the root. Shirley didn't have a gun, didn't have login credentials, didn't sit in briefings, but she had something more dangerous, a memory that had never faded, and silence kept long enough to sharpen into a blade. No one knew she was still watching. No one knew she'd never really left. But now that she'd started speaking, the system had nowhere left to hide. Hans was organizing printed documents in the garage. Scattered across the floor were partially encrypted notes, connection diagrams, and copies of traffic camera stills, all being stacked into prioritized action piles. Just as he inserted the backup USB into the encrypted lock drive, he heard footsteps behind him, not heavy, not rushed, but off rhythm, unnatural, like someone trying to walk quietly but not quite well enough to fool the instincts of a man who had once survived by sound alone. Hans started to turn, but was slammed against the wall. A hard object, possibly a baton handle or the butt of a pistol, struck his ribs. His arms were pinned behind him, face pressed to the cold cement floor. A knee drove into his neck, firm enough to restrain, not break. The garage door was still open. Light from outside slanted through the gap, splitting the space into 2 halves, normal and disturbed. "Don't scream," a low, gravelly voice whispered in his ear, dry and cold, like steel scraping concrete. "We don't need you to disappear, just to stop." A hand yanked his jacket collar, pressing him into the ground like stamping ownership. Then another voice, younger, softer, but equally ruthless, murmured from behind, "Touch this again, and your kid dies." No shouting, no cursing, no drama, just like a traffic officer reciting a rule, cold from repetition. Hans drew a slow breath, keeping his heartbeat steady. In under 2 seconds, he processed what mattered. The man pinning him down weighed about 90 kilos, thick with muscle but slightly off balance, used to force more than technique. A faint scar on his right wrist, someone who'd either worn cuffs or cut himself. Short breaths, probably a smoker. The second man stood to the left, lighter, faster, tapped Hans's side with his foot like checking for movement. No scent of gun oil, no gear weight. They weren't armed. More importantly, they weren't here to kill. They were here to send a message. But they had the wrong target. They didn't know Hans had once taught counterinterrogation in hostile territory, where being half a second late could cost your life. He didn't resist, not yet. He waited a beat. When the one on top shifted slightly to reposition, Hans rolled his right wrist, dropped his shoulder, twisted his hips left, throwing the attacker off balance. A shoulder thrust to the sternum made him collapse. Hans spun, swung his leg up, nailed the man's knee, then drove his elbow into his jaw. Muffled grunt. Then the heavy thud of a body hitting concrete. The second one lunged, but Hans was already moving. A knee strike to the lower abdomen, precise, not overly strong, but dead on. The man folded, legs buckling. It took just 8 seconds for them to go from dominant to defeated. Oh, he didn't kill them, but his final kick to the second man's shoulder made him yelp in a strangled groan. "You don't know what you're messing with." Hans crouched, picked up a multi-tool knife near the toolbox. He didn't flip the blade, didn't threaten, just held it, looked, cold. "I know," he said, voice like forged steel. "That's exactly why I won't stop." Then he flipped the main light switch. The garage flooded with harsh white light, forcing both intruders to flinch. Only now were their faces visible. One of them was the same man who'd stood near the security post at the police station the day Hans filed the complaint. The one who'd looked at Hans and smiled, like he already knew that complaint wouldn't go anywhere. Hans looked down, smiling back, this time for real. "Knew you looked familiar." He didn't call the police. Didn't call Theo. He understood. If they were bold enough to come into the garage, it meant someone inside the system knew exactly what he was doing, where he was, and what his next move might be. And if they felt confident enough to come unarmed, unmasked, it meant they thought he couldn't fight back. Their first mistake. Founder locked the door, drew the blackout curtains. Then he sat down, opened his backup laptop, the one not connected to the internet, used solely to monitor close-range signals. He ran a command to search for unidentified devices that had pinged the garage's Wi-Fi, or Bluetooth, over the past 72 hours. One result popped up. A device labeled AX472DG connected for exactly 3 minutes and 18 seconds at 3:41 AUM, less than half an hour after Hans had transmitted the encrypted Evelyn footage to 3 storage nodes. No one else had that data, except Hans, Theo, and those tracking them. Hence wasn't surprised. He grabbed a screwdriver, unscrewed the metal panel above the garage door, and found the spot where the signal had flickered a few times recently. A small device dropped into his palm, about the length of 3 fingers, magnet-mounted. A low-frequency GPS tracker, subtle enough to evade most jamming systems, not civilian-grade, not standard military either, the kind of gear used by special units or passed down through black market logistics from federally funded contractors. Hans fired up the electromagnetic burner and tossed the device in. A soft pop, then the chip split in 2. But he knew destroying one didn't mean ending the source. They'd come once. It meant they were testing the limits, watching his reactions, recording how a man under threat would behave. He turned to the whiteboard and the diagram Shirley had provided. Carlson, Brenner, and Fry are already marked at the center, but now he added a new branch in black marker. Outer force, the kind that doesn't appear in reports, isn't logged in any system, but acts in its name. Beneath that, he drew 3 slashes, unidentified, undescribed. A reminder, the enemy no longer wears uniforms. Hans jotted 3 points into his ops notebook. 1. All equipment, drives, and documents must be relocated from the garage tonight. 2. Evelyn must be moved. Nowhere connected to him is safe. 3. Every next step must be calculated with the assumption that surveillance is ongoing and retaliation is imminent. He brought up a still from Evelyn's video, the frame where the headlights hit her face, her eyes bloodshot, but her gaze unbroken. He stared at it for a few seconds, then turned off the screen. Not to avoid emotion, but to lock in the reason. He couldn't afford to fall back. From now on, this investigation was no longer a lone father seeking justice. This was a direct engagement between a man trained to survive war and a system that believed it could hide in the shadows forever. And this time, the shadows had stepped too close, unaware they had just awakened the last man they should have touched. The bunker was hidden beneath an old warehouse in the Eastern Industrial Zone. once used as a simulated drone operations base by Theo during wartime. Since the military withdrawal, the entire area had been abandoned, disconnected from the city's power grid, and omitted from most updated civilian maps. The entrance was concealed behind a rotting wooden shelf stacked with fake cardboard boxes. A nearly 15-centimeter thick steel door was locked by a fingerprint scanner combined with thermal identification, not easy to find and even harder to breach. Hans had known about it for years, once checking it as a last resort option, but never believed he'd actually use it. Not because it wasn't secure, but because he never thought a situation would be dire enough to force him to hide his daughter from daylight. He woke Evelyn at 4 a.m. The sky was still dark. The city is still asleep. The house lights remained off. "Grab your things, come with me, now," Hans said. His voice was low, not rushed, but with the crisp command tone that left no room for question. Evelyn got up, still weak from days of recovery. Her face still bore bruises, the corner of her lip a dull shade of purple. "What's going on, Dad?" she asked quietly. Hans didn't answer right away. He stood by the door, checked his watch, then said, "I don't know what's coming, but if something does, I need to know you're somewhere no one can find you." Evelyn nodded. No more questions. They left the house in the first car, Theo's old sedan, fitted with fake plates. They drove through 3 districts, each in a different direction. Hans constantly checked the mirrors, occasionally swerving into parking lots, waiting 2 minutes, then resuming. After 40 minutes, they stopped at an old container yard, switched to a second SUV parked in advance, and locked with a private code. Evelyn stayed silent the whole ride. Ever since that night she had learned, some questions don't need answers. You just look into your father's eyes, and you know. And today, his eyes weren't anxious, they were focused. The same look she had only seen in old training photos when he peered through a sniper scope. When they arrived, Evelyn stepped out, facing the rusted steel door hidden behind the shelf. She stared at it for a long time, not out of fear, but understanding. This wasn't a place to hide. This was a place where the man who once promised never to put his daughter near danger now had no choice but to do the opposite, to protect her from something the law could no longer control. Inside, Theo had everything ready. A single bed, 2 cabinets of vacuum-packed food enough for 3 weeks, filtered water, a dual-layer air purifier, encrypted 2-way communication unconnected to the internet, and a perimeter of motion sensors spanning 20 meters. No Wi-Fi, no cellular signal, no cameras, only hardwired cables linking to a private server buried in the wall, untouchable by anything but human hands. Hans placed his hand on Evelyn's shoulder, looking her straight in the eye. He didn't bend down, he didn't soften his words, just said firmly, "This is the safest place for you right now." Evelyn nodded without blinking. "And you?" she asked. Hans exhaled slowly. "I'll be outside, leading them away from here." Evelyn didn't cry. She wasn't the type, but her hand clenched his coat as if trying to keep a piece of him before he vanished behind the door he had built to never be found. When the steel door sealed shut behind Evelyn, the sound echoed in Hans's mind, like the final click of a mode that could no longer be undone. No more waiting, no more restraint. He had placed his daughter out of the blast zone, and now it was his turn to step into the eye of the storm. He left through the underground path, once a heat exhaust tunnel from wartime infrastructure, 3 security gates leading straight to the back lot of Industrial Zone 7. There, Hans switched to a 3rd vehicle. Fake plates, blackout windows, a spoofed GPS transmitter built in to mislead any tracking attempts. No phone, no smartwatch, no device that had ever touched a network. Just a laptop running a custom secure OS. No cache, no autoconnect, functioning only on isolated wired networks. Within 30 minutes of leaving the bunker, Theo initiated his next task, erasing Hans's digital footprint from all public systems. IP logs were replaced with fake proxies, device MAC addresses were scrambled, browser history was scrambled by a script simulating activity suggesting Hans had flown out of state that morning. His bank accounts were technically frozen due to a fake login attempt, from Canada. From that moment forward, as far as the system was concerned, Hans Carter no longer existed. No one knew where he was, except Theo and, if necessary, Shirley, but even they only knew fragments. No one held the full map. That's how Hans had learned it in his unit. No single link should have enough intel to compromise the mission. At the second hideout, an abandoned fire department equipment depot, Hans conducted a full security sweep, thermal sensors, mechanical fingerprint locks, and emergency exits. He rebuilt the strategic board using a giant wall panel, city maps, key traffic nodes, locations of incidents tied to Carlson, Brenner, Fry, and the administrative lines Shirley had provided. At the center, he wrote in the boldest font yet, who ordered the assault. Hans no longer cared whether what happened to Evelyn was by procedure. He had the video. He had the pattern. The issue now wasn't proving an act. It was exposing the system that had shielded it. For how long, how effectively, and under whose directive. In the dark, they thought he was afraid, retreating, hiding, but Hans wasn't hiding. He was severing comms, scrambling signals, erasing trails, just like he used to in Syria when planting devices deep inside enemy lines without leaving a trace. Go dark, erase the trail, leave the grid, not to disappear, but to reappear where the system would never see it coming. Ramirez stepped out of the late-night diner on 14th Street, hands still greasy from fried chicken, sleeves rolled up, collar soaked with sweat from the muggy air. He had just lit a cigarette when a low voice, not loud but sharp enough to drive straight into his spine, came from a bench near the parking lot. "If I were one of them, you'd be dead before your plate was cleared." Ramirez spun around. No gun drawn, no unnecessary reaction. Instinct told him he'd recognize that voice from the first word. Hans, the father whose daughter had been beaten unconscious. The man who filed a complaint, then vanished from the radar, like he'd been swallowed whole by the very system he dared to challenge. The man Oak Ridge PD now whispered about with a name no one dared say aloud, the Resistance Ghost. Hans stepped out of the shadows, like he belonged to them, calm, unhurried, no threats, just a thin black file folder in hand, unmarked. He sat on the flower bed edge near the curb and opened the folder toward Ramirez. "Evelyn, beaten before she even reached for her ID. This footage was never logged in the system. I found it myself. You were there. You didn't hit her, but you didn't stop it either." Ramirez said nothing. His eyes didn't go to the folder. They stared at the rough asphalt below his feet, as if the answers lay buried there. Hans continued, steady, measured. "I'm not here to drag you to court. I don't need an apology. I just want you to stop standing still, or at the very least, stand in the right direction." Ramirez took a drag from his cigarette, exhaling slowly. "The cost of standing the right way is a lost career. You know that?" Hans nodded. "I do. But the cost of standing the wrong way is worse. You don't just lose your job. You lose whatever's left of yourself." Ramirez finally looked up. His eyes held no arrogance, no sarcasm, just the fatigue of someone who spent too long on the fault line between right and wrong, wondering how much of his conscience was still intact. "So, what do you want?" Hans didn't change tone. "Information, not evidence, not files. Just direction. Who's scrubbing the logs? Who's behind Carlson? Who coordinates with internal dispatch? Who wipes the cameras after a signal loss? You don't have to record anything. Don't need to write a report. I just need you to keep me one step ahead." Ramirez closed his eyes for a few seconds, then opened them again, steadier now. "I could die for this, or live as a walking corpse," Hans replied. No softening, no retreat. Silence. Long. Long enough to hear a freight truck pass across the street. Long enough to hear shopkeepers locking up at the corner. Long enough to know this wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a turning point. Ramirez nodded. Slow, deliberate, like signing a sentence on himself. Just once. Hans stood, placed the file on the hood of Ramirez's car. Sometimes once is all it takes to save a life. As Hans walked away, Ramirez remained where he was. The cigarette had gone cold, but it stayed between his lips. He wasn't a hero, not a victim. He was a link, one that seemed small but was now deciding whether the system would cannibalize itself or be stripped bare by someone who once stood inside it. 3 years earlier, Ramirez graduated from the State Police Academy with near-perfect marks. He was called the model of the new generation. Calm, communicative, able to de-escalate tension without force. He didn't carry illusions of changing the whole system, but he believed he could be different. Oak Ridge picked him for what they called a soft mind in a hard machine. But no one told him getting into the system was one thing, surviving it was another. In his first 6 months, Ramirez saw things that they never taught in any training manual. An officer is editing a report moments before submission, another accidentally losing body cam footage during a complaint review, forced entries whitewashed as assisted arrests, street-level beatings filed under risk mitigation. Every time he asked, the answer was the same: it's nothing. Everyone does it. He didn't join in, but he didn't speak up either. Part of it was fear of being pushed out. Part of it was naivety, still believing that if he stayed silent long enough, he'd eventually have a chance to fix things from the inside. Someone had once told him, to change it, you have to survive it first. Then came that night. The night Carlson and Brenner pulled over Evelyn. Ramirez was across the street, playing secondary observer. He didn't step in, didn't walk away. He stood in the middle, a place that felt safe at the time, but later he realized was the most dangerous of all, where he could clearly hear Evelyn crying, see the blood running from her lip to her shirt, see Carlson's hand still trembling after the punch, and still hear him lie to dispatch over the radio in a voice so calm it was obscene. Ramirez stood there, like a blank whiteboard, no protest, no interference, no action. That night, he couldn't sleep, but the next morning he still wore the uniform, still went to work, still said all clear when his superior asked, and that was the last day he could see himself as an ordinary person. Since then, every time he looked in the mirror, he saw someone who had stood between right and wrong and called that silence duty. Now, Hans stood before him, not accusing, not begging, not threatening, just watching, as if he knew too well what it felt like to swallow your voice night after night, to stand beside wrongdoing and lack the courage to name it. Ramirez took the USB, slipped it into his shirt pocket, said nothing. But as he turned to go, he paused, just long enough to say one sentence, not loud, not quiet, but echoing inside his own mind. I won't betray the badge, but I won't let the badge turn me into someone who betrays himself. Hans didn't answer. He just watched. For the first time, he didn't see a hesitant rookie or a scared bystander. He saw a man wrestling with the silence he once chose, with feet that had stepped back, thinking that meant safety, with a spine once held upright, but afraid to turn around. That night, Ramirez didn't become a hero, but he stopped being a blank slate. And in that choice, an old conscience thought dead began to stir again. The house sat in the middle of an abandoned residential strip in northern Oak Ridge, once slated to become the city's new logistics hub. But after the 2018 financial crisis, the entire project was halted mid-development. 3-story houses left unfinished. Bare concrete walls, windows without glass. Power, water, and surveillance infrastructure had been dismantled in 2021 after a budget dispute. The place had become a blind spot, literally, on the city map. No residents, no foot traffic, no oversight. For Shirley, it was perfect. She had once filed inspection reports for the area when still in the force, had criticized undeclared log erasures from surveillance systems, had witnessed firsthand how a pursuit was rewritten into an internal risk assessment. They've erased trails here before, altered reports, she said, pointing to the lot on the map. Now we use it to flip their rules against them. Hans picked a house in the middle of the block. 3 stories, wooden stairs still usable, steel frame walls sturdy enough for reinforcement. It didn't need to be pretty, just sealed and controllable. It took Teo exactly 2 days to install an independent surveillance system. 3 micro-infrared cameras hidden in ceiling hooks, 2 directional mics embedded in door frames, and a spoofed router broadcasting a fake police internal network signal within a 15-meter radius. enough to fool any scanner into thinking it was just a temporary relay point. On the outside, the house looked forgotten, but inside it was House 0, dead space on the city grid, but the only live node on Hans's. The bait was written by Hans himself, down to every punctuation mark. A fabricated internal message, composed with the tone, structure, and jargon of police dispatchers. It read, "Shirley R. has been confirmed to have retrieved legacy internal coordination records from old archives. Intent unknown. Internal sources suggest she may intend to expose patrol system irregularities from 201. The message was attached to an old ID channel, one only accessible by those who once had clearance to alter camera logs or edit secured records. Shirley read the lines and nodded. Cold. They're not afraid of evidence. They're afraid of anything that makes people question the system, and that I still have. The question was, how to make them bite without sensing the hook. That's where Ramirez came in. While not fully aligned with Hans, Ramirez was close enough to listen and leak intel at just the right moment. He reported back. Carlson and Brenner would personally verify the intel instead of escalating it. No paperwork, no prior call, just an internal info check. Hans nodded. If they won't report upward, they're scared. And the more scared they are, the more exposed they become. The plan was set. Hans would monitor the second floor. Shirley would be on the ground floor pretending to guard the files. Theo would operate the system from a surveillance van parked 3 blocks away. No one else knew, not even Ramirez. If successful, the recording would confirm this wasn't just about 2 rogue actors. It was a network choosing to clean up internally to protect itself. House 0 wasn't on the official city map, but if this worked, it would be etched into the record as the place where the entire system began to fracture from within, using the same tools it once used to silence others. That night, wind howled through rusted metal sheets across the street, creating a hollow, dragging sound, like the whisper of a city long forgotten. The neighborhood had no lights, no people, no cameras, but the house in the middle, House 0, was wide awake. Inside, every detail was intentional. Shirley sat on the first floor in a room lit only by a dangling yellow bulb, the shadows tilted sideways like in an old noir film. She wore a faded cardigan, hands trembling around a large fake file folder. The real files weren't there. But her expression needed no acting. The woman who had stayed silent for 2 decades now wore her truest face, confronting the past. Part of her had lived long enough to know this could be her last stand, and if it was, it would matter. Upstairs, Hans sat in a dark room, lit only by his laptop screen displaying 3 infrared views: front door, stairwell, and the room where Shirley sat. The sound from the 2-directional mics piped through his earpiece. His hand hovered over the remote camera control switch. No weapons, no talking, no hesitation. 3 blocks away, Theo sat inside a van disguised as an electrical maintenance truck. In front of him was a real-time encryption rig. Signals were simultaneously recorded onto 3 hard drives, one of which was live transmitting to an off-grid cloud node in another state. No one could destroy all 3. No one could jam the signal. It had already split before arriving. 2217. A dark SUV pulled up outside. No plates, no interior light. 2 men stepped out. One was clearly Brenner, recognizable by his slanted gait. Through the door crack, Shirley identified the other, Dominic Keel, former personal driver to the chief inspector of Oak Ridge PD, a name that once appeared in an internal inquiry, then vanished from all records overnight. The door opened. Keel entered first. "Where are the files?" he asked, voice dry as sandpaper. Shirley stood, her hands trembling just enough to look genuine. I'm not going public. I need to know if I'm in danger." Brenner closed the door, pulled the curtain shut. "You're putting yourself in danger," he said, stepping forward. "We'll review the files. If there's nothing serious, you're safe. But if there is..." He didn't finish, just looked at Keel. The man took out his phone and sent a message. That signal was Theo's cue. Recording systems went fully live. A command line lit up Hans's laptop. Audio recording. Video synced. "You know the rules," Brenner said, hands in his pockets. "We don't act unless someone acts first. But if you open your mouth, your son in Ohio disappears." And that's the gentle version. In the control room, Hans didn't blink. Shirley remained seated. Her hand pressed a hidden trigger under the table, confirming recording status. Every line, every syllable, every threat, not a guess, not speculation, a confession, spoken aloud under the belief that no one was listening. House Zero didn't need guns, didn't need arrests. It just needed one threat, captured at the right time, in the right place, in the right way, to flip the entire system from control to crisis. And from this moment on, every person who once ordered silence was now the one whose voice would echo on the evening news. The ground floor room of House Zero still reeked of the stale dampness from unfinished plaster and rotted wood, dating back to when construction first halted. No overhead lights, just a single flickering tube casting a pale glow over Shirley's face. She sat still on a backless wooden chair, one hand lightly resting on a pre-stage file folder, her head slightly tilted. Her breathing was steady, as if nothing important was happening. But beneath the cardigan sleeve, a recording mic hidden at her wrist was capturing every vibration, every sharp breath, every stressed syllable from the men who were confessing without even knowing it. Brenner approached and pulled out the chair across from her. He sat down casually, legs crossed, the posture of a man at home in his private interrogation room. Keel lingered in the corner, eyes scanning the room quickly. He held his phone, but not to call. He was snapping, sending, checking. Every move screamed covert surveillance. But in this room, he wasn't the only one watching. "You're not the first," Brenner began. His voice was flat, emotionless, like reading a script he'd recited too many times to care. "We've dealt with this before. No leaks, no headlines, fast, clean, no one ever knows." He shrugged, drumming his fingers lightly on the chair arm. "Evelyn was number 12, if I'm counting right. 12, not 1. Young, black, with an attitude, easy target, always thinking comply and you'll be safe." He chuckled, not with humor, but with the satisfaction of a butcher recounting a clean kill. Shirley said nothing, no expression, just tilted her head slightly, like someone hard of hearing. But in truth, she held the exact pose she'd been trained for, the perfect angle for clean audio pickup, unobstructed by sleeves or folds. Every word Brenner spoke was being relayed in real time through an encryption chip smaller than a USB drive, hidden in the button of her blouse. Keel finally spoke after minutes of quiet analysis. "You think the FBI will act on a file with no confirmed source?" His voice was cool, clinical. "We know which cameras lost signal. We know who deleted the logs. We know who was told to see nothing. And most of all, we know who chooses silence." He stepped closer, placing a hand on the back of Shirley's chair. "This city doesn't run on truth. It survives on silence. Speak, you disappear. Obey, you're protected. That's simple." Shirley turned her head slightly, a tiny movement, just enough for the mic to capture Keel's breath. She didn't respond. Brenner jumped back in, his tone tinged with smugness, like a man flaunting a well-kept record. "Evelyn should have been protected too, but she was stupid. She talked. She filed a report. And she got stopped. Lucky for us, we caught it early. Took care of it before the media got a whiff." He leaned back, fingers tapping his knee. "And if you plan on going any further, Shirley," he locked eyes with her, his stare cold, oiled steel, "I'm not sure the accidents will stop with you. Your son's in Ohio, right? Plays basketball. Grant High School?" 1 second of silence, heavy as stone. No one in that room knew their threats, their boasts, their smug admissions were being heard live inside the Eastern Regional FBI office, where 3 federal agents, headphones on, eyes wide, fingers poised over validation terminals, were recording everything. And in the moment those 2 men believed they were intimidating a powerless woman, they didn't realize their own voices were sealing the fate of a network they thought untouchable. Over 200 miles from Oak Ridge, in the Eastern FBI field office, 3 agents stayed behind for the weekend shift. The room was quiet until a system alert flashed at the center console. X-ray survival, fresh case character, // Agent Monica Dawes dropped her coffee instantly. She recognized that name. Not just a former advisor who helped dismantle a trafficking ring 8 years ago, but the man once invited to join the Bureau, who had declined to focus on family. Monica tapped the keyboard, activating the encryption channel. The transmission began. Audio, video, GPS coordinates, encrypted with a federal-only protocol. "You'll want to hear this," said a fellow agent, handing her a spare headset. The audio streamed into her ears, a woman's voice, slow, low, calm. Shirley, then arrogant male voices. Keel, Brenner. No one in the room needed context, because within the first 45 seconds, the recording captured 3 undeniable crimes: death threats, unlawful assault admission, and evidence of an organized cover-up. Dawes turned to the tech officer. "Tape everything, triple copy it. 1 to Internal Affairs, 1 directly to the Federal Law Enforcement Oversight Division, and 1 raw, untouched, to our max security server." 1 click, and the confession, once trapped between 4 crumbling walls, was now in the hands of those who'd never bowed to any local system. Back in House Zero, Hans stared at a secondary monitor, watching the indicator blink. Stream, active, FBI linked, 327 live. He didn't say a word, just nodded. The live system had activated as planned. No files stored locally, no device held a backup. Every piece of data, audio, video, GPS, was pushed through multi-layered cloud systems with remote wipe protocols on detection. Shirley still sat calmly. Brenner had begun pulling out his phone to verify something, but it was too late. Much too late. Across town, Officer Ramirez sat in his patrol car when a one-lil text from Theo popped up. He just went live on a federal channel. Ramirez read it. His hand trembled, not from fear, but because he understood. This could no longer be buried. For the first time in his 3 years in uniform, he felt something shift, something real, something good. The men who thought they were threatening had just turned themselves into evidence. The words they believed would vanish into dusty walls were now echoing in the ears of people far beyond Oak Ridge's control. And from that moment forward, the system they thought they owned was no longer theirs. Brenner had just risen to his feet, phone still in hand, ready to call his fixer, someone he trusted to make things disappear like always, when the back door of House Zero opened. No sound, no warning, no footsteps. Just a figure appearing from the shadows, like it had been summoned by the very darkness Brenner and Keel believed they controlled. Keel turned by reflex, but too late. Hans emerged like a sentence being passed. No shouting, no rage. He moved fast, low and sure, like a spear released the moment Evelyn's body hit the pavement. The first punch, a clean arc to Keel's jaw, didn't break bones, but shut down resistance within seconds. Before Keel could collapse, Hans grabbed his collar, twisted him, and slammed him into the wall with a shoulder drive, like sealing off an escape route. "Don't move," Hans said, voice low, each word sharp as steel. "You move, I'll make sure you never walk again." It wasn't loud, but it landed harder than any blade. Brenner reacted on instinct, hand diving into his coat to pull a Glock. But Hans had predicted it. He sidestepped, ducked low, swept his leg like he was still on a seal mat. Brenner fell hard, the gun flying into a corner. Hans didn't kick it away. He picked it up, disassembled it in front of him, piece by piece, stripping the man of illusion as easily as dismantling a weapon. "This is what makes you feel powerful," he said, tossing the grip to the ground. "Then I'll take it before you even use it." Shirley stepped back, calm. She hadn't planned for this, but she understood. Hans wasn't going too far. He was finishing what the system had delayed too long. Brenner scrambled upright and shouted, "You're crazy! I'm an offie!" He didn't finish. Hans pushed his head onto the table, not hard, but enough. Just enough to bruise his pride without drawing blood. Then, steady as ever, Hans leaned in. "You're alive because I chose it." Brenner gasped, sweat running down his temple. His fear wasn't pain. It was the panic of a man who no longer controlled anything. Hans didn't strike again. He didn't need to. He stepped back half a pace, eyes locked in quiet judgment. "I used to train soldiers to end a target in 8 seconds, he said. "But today, I want you alive." He turned to Keel, still pale, holding his cheek, then looked back at Brenner, now slumped like a caged animal. "Not because I forgive you, but because I want you to carry this fear for the rest of your lives. Every night you sleep, every time you open a door, every time you see a father walking toward you. And in that moment, without a bullet or blood, Hans stripped them of the final illusion of control, the belief that they were justified." Keel collapsed onto the dirty floor, face down, Hans's knuckle imprint fresh on his skin. He gasped, then tried to sit up, only to sink again, back against the wall, head in hands. He wasn't broken by force, but by exposure. Hans didn't look his way again. He stood in the center of the room, no weapon, no armor, but somehow the room shrank around him, as if justice itself had walked in barefoot, cold, and unrelenting. Brenner staggered to his knees, blood trickling from his nose. He braced himself on the cracked floor, trying to raise his head, his pride clinging to its last breath. "I'll sue you, officer, assault. This is a trap. You're—" Hans leaned forward. No threats, just clarity. "A trap?" he repeated. "You walked in, you spoke, you confessed, you testified." Each word fell like stone, shaped by a father's exhausted restraint. Then he turned to Keel, huddled in the corner, as if hiding his face would hide his guilt. "And you, the loyal driver, you thought loyalty to a rotten system was noble? No, you're just a cog in a legalized death machine, and today it spat you out." Hans didn't move closer. He left them sitting there, broken not by violence, but by the weight of their own words. Recorded, encrypted, and transmitted. No one died, but every threat, every confession, every proud admission had already reached Washington, and there was no taking it back. Hans walked toward the door, slow, unhurried. When his hand touched the cold steel handle, he stopped. His voice was calm but clear, as if saved for this exact moment. "I'm not waiting for the FBI, because you don't deserve to be arrested like criminals." He turned back, looked them straight in the eyes, not with rage but with resolve. "You deserve to be strangled by your own conscience, every day, every night." Hans didn't kill. He didn't need to. There were no cuffs, no blood. What he left behind was the deepest sentence of all: survival soaked in shame, the horror of exposure, the knowing that their voices, their faces, their names were now part of something far beyond Oak Ridge. The two men who once thought they were the law, the wall, the sword, were now just wreckage on the floor of a forgotten room. And from that moment on, justice no longer belonged to officers, judges, or a system. It belonged to those who stood, people like Hans. Evelyn stood in front of her father's silver-gray car in the underground lot beneath the old warehouse, once a storage for evidence, weapons, now repurposed as a starting point for something else. There were no stage lights, no urging voices, no cameras, live streams, or cheap cheers, just her and the wheel, and a hum of fear murmuring inside her chest. The car was unchanged. The familiar smell of leather seats, a faint scratch running just below the left side mirror, a scar left from the night she was pulled out of the car like a criminal. She didn't touch it, but she looked at it, longer than necessary, as if staring long enough might dissolve the memory into rust and dust. But it didn't. It remained, and so did she. She opened the door. The creak of the hinge wasn't loud, but it tore the silence like a seam. Her hand rested on the steering wheel, cold, steady, and it made her heart beat so fast she had to close her eyes for a few seconds. Theo stood a few steps away, leaning against a concrete pillar, hands in his coat pockets. He didn't say a word. He knew his job wasn't to say things like, "You've got this," or "Don't be scared." Hans had told him, she doesn't need comfort, she needs space, but also someone there in case it breaks. So he just stood there, a silent anchor, like a launch pad that didn't need to shine. Evelyn inhaled, turned the key. The engine rumbled softly. Everything was normal, but nothing inside her felt normal. She closed her eyes, swore the engine was screaming. It wasn't, just the wind. But her body was taut like a drawn wire, and her right hand trembled lightly, just holding the wheel. A minute passed. No gear shift, no acceleration, just her eyes on the rearview mirror. It reflected her face, not that of a 17-year-old, but someone who'd stepped out of a wreck the system pretended never happened. She started counting, in her head, not aloud. 1, 2, 3. Her right foot gently pressed the gas. The car inched forward, slowly, carefully, not fast, not eager, but the wheels broke the dead point. The first lap, the steering felt stiff, like the car itself was cautious of the person sitting behind the wheel again after that night. But Evelyn didn't stop. She made the first turn. Too wide. Not perfect, but not wrong. 1 lap, then another. Each time the tires touched a familiar line, another memory surfaced. The scream. Her arm twisted, blood on her lips. But she didn't stop. She took another lap. This time the blinker flashed on time. The corner was tighter. Her blinking slowed. Breathing started to settle. Theo, watching through a handheld monitor, no recording, just real time, didn't observe to supervise, only to be sure. He watched the car's headlights trace their slow, precise path around the lot, a recovery orbit. After the 5th lap, Evelyn brought the car to a stop, in the exact same spot. But she didn't turn off the engine, hands still on the wheel. Her gaze drifted through the windshield toward the road out of the city, the place where last time she'd been dragged out like a suspect. She wasn't driving out there today, but her eyes had already gone ahead. She opened the door, stepped out. Cold air swept into her coat. Theo approached. No words, but Evelyn turned to him. Slowly. I'm not trying to become a good driver again. I just don't want to live the rest of my life with my heart trying to escape my chest every time the light turns green. A quiet pause, then an exhale. Like unloading a stone from her back. Theo said nothing, just stood there, witness to the moment a survivor chooses to return behind the wheel. Healing doesn't mean erasing memory. It means driving while still remembering, while still trembling, while still hurting, but not stopping. And today, Evelyn was no longer a victim. She was the one choosing the route. For the first time since it all began, the car circled the abandoned warehouse lot, silent as if even the space itself made way for something awakening. Evelyn sat at the wheel, back straight but not tense, eyes ahead. Watching from the feed, Theo tracked each steering correction. Slow, cautious, but no longer shaking. No more shrinking. No more fear crumpled in her limbs. With every turn, the headlights swept across dust-caked concrete walls. No music played. She didn't need it. Only the sound of rubber on pavement, even, grounded. She didn't speak through the comm, but every motion spoke for her. When she reached the far end of the lot, she signaled left, turned around, as if each curve was a challenge she now chose to face. Eyes open. Each time the wheel shifted, her face caught the light, still lined with fear, like ash not yet cooled. But underneath, something else had taken root. 3 laps, then 4. No one timed it, no one measured the distance, but Theo knew the ground Evelyn covered tonight was larger than any map could measure. On the 5th lap, she brought the car to a stop, right at the center of the lot where a narrow road branched out, reconnecting with the rest of the city. She didn't cut the engine, didn't let go of the wheel, didn't reverse. She just sat, eyes fixed forward, where a distant intersection blinked red like a heartbeat waiting to be reclaimed. She wasn't ready to go there yet, but she knew one day she would. Not out of defiance, not to prove a point, but because she refused to let her life be forever defined by one night of someone else's abuse of power. Theo walked up, slowly, stopped a few paces from the car, not interrupting the moment. She remained seated, hands resting calmly on her lap, eyes not on him but aware he was there. "You don't need to say anything," she said, voice steady, not loud, not shaking. "I'm not trying to be a great driver again. I just don't want to walk the streets forever dodging the gaze of every man in uniform." Theo nodded. No smile, no pep talk. just a nod, from someone who understood this wasn't a statement for response, it was a declaration. I'm still here, and I'm moving forward. Evelyn didn't need validation. She didn't want to be called brave victim in a headline. She wasn't a poster girl for anyone's awareness campaign. She didn't want to sit in front of a camera and retell a pain that already echoed enough in her bones. She just wanted to control her own car again, to reclaim what was ripped from her. The right to simply exist, to choose her own direction, without being defined by what someone else did to her. Surviving doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering, and not letting it own you. Evelyn knew she'd someday drive past that intersection. She might see a patrol car, might hear a familiar phrase from a stranger's mouth, but next time, she wouldn't shrink into her seat. She wouldn't look down at the wheel. She would look straight ahead and keep going, because she no longer lived in that night. Evelyn didn't need to prove she was strong. She just refused to be forced into weakness. And that was the beginning of a real victory. When a survivor stops letting others define them by the things meant to break them, victim is not a permanent title. It can be rewritten by the one who lived it in a chapter they named themselves. Hans lay on a thin mattress in a back room of the old warehouse. No real bed, no windows. Just a fluorescent light buzzing from the concrete ceiling. Bright, but cold. He didn't turn it off, not because he feared the dark, but because he knew that once the light went out, his mind would have nothing left to hold on to, and in that void, the images he had been trying to bury for weeks would come back, out of order, without logic, like a tape spinning in reverse. Evelyn's scream, the car door slamming, the sound of someone's hand striking her face, the blood that didn't even make a sound but somehow tore his heart open beat by beat. He had once slept through bombings. In Syria, he could fall asleep underground with an armed squad combing the area above. In Congo, he'd dozed next to the body of a prisoner just rescued. No ambush had ever stolen his sleep. But now, in a city with a name as calm as Oak Ridge, where he once took his daughter to paddle boats, where he and his late wife used to share pastries, he couldn't sleep for more than 5 minutes. Every time his eyelids dropped, his ears would start playing back the sounds his body had memorized, even if his brain wanted to forget. The door being kicked in, the gun being drawn, Evelyn crying, but drowned out by someone yelling, resisting arrest. Nothing played in full, just fragments, like his psyche now fractured. One night, around 2 a.m., Hans shot upright as if someone had grabbed his throat. His shirt was soaked with sweat. His hand instinctively reached for an M9 that wasn't there. The floor was cold, empty. He hadn't carried a weapon since leaving the military. His body trembled slightly, not from fear, but because, for the first time, he didn't know how to fight the pain inside himself. He looked toward the door. Light spilled in from the hallway. A moment later, it creaked open. Theo. He didn't say anything, didn't step inside, just looked, as if checking Hans was still breathing, then quietly closed it again. Hans leaned against the wall, head in his hands. His eyes wouldn't close anymore. He used to believe he was beyond harm. The kind of man who'd stood in open fire, made life or death calls in under 3 seconds. He believed that with discipline and strategy, everything could be kept under control. But no one ever trained him to face this, his teenage daughter, who had never broken the law, being beaten in the middle of the street, then cuffed, humiliated, called things no father should ever hear, especially from someone wearing a badge. There was no protocol for that moment, no manual for standing in a hospital room, watching your daughter with gauze on one cheek, swollen wrists and blood on her lips, and being completely powerless, too late, too far away, and worse, knowing you didn't stop it before it began. He used to believe that his presence alone could keep her safe. That illusion had shattered. Something in Hans had broken. Not his belief in himself, but the illusion that battlefield experience could protect those he loved in peacetime. But the America he came back to wasn't at peace. It was a social minefield, where skin color dictated the speed of a cop's trigger finger. In that room, with the lights always on, Hans didn't cry. He didn't scream, didn't break anything, but it was that calm amidst a mind collapsing inside. that betrayed the deepest wound. He didn't fear the dark. He feared what the dark made visible again. He feared seeing Evelyn on the pavement, alone, with no one saving her but her own terrified voice, the one the system labeled a threat. Some wounds don't bleed. Hans knew that better than anyone, not because of the scars on his body, but because of the men he'd seen fall apart from what no one could see. The silent pain, the blank stare of someone who lost everything but had no words left to explain. Now, he had become one of them. His real wound didn't come from the fists thrown in House Zero, not from kicks or shouting. It came from that moment in the hospital. His daughter lying there, blood in her hair, bruises on her wrist, and a look in her eyes that no longer recognized the world she once trusted. For the first time in his life, Hans felt helpless. Not from weakness, not because he lost a fight, but because he finally understood that the things he thought could shield his family, his badge, his training, his former Navy SEAL title, meant nothing in front of a system that didn't see his daughter as human. They didn't shoot him. They didn't storm his house. They didn't have to. They struck from behind. By labeling Evelyn a suspect, by saying she refused to comply, by silently deleting body cam footage that could have cleared her. They struck with paper, with words, with invisible power built on silence and complicity. Hans once saw himself as the shield, the one who stood between danger and his family. He believed if he held his ground, stayed upright, didn't bend, then those behind him would be safe. But the night Evelyn was beaten, all that belief collapsed. He didn't stop it. He wasn't there. And worse, nothing he had ever earned could stop the system from doing it again. From that moment, Hans had no choice, no luxury of standing aside, no room left to wait and see if the system works, because he knew if he stayed silent, another father, another mother, another daughter would walk into an emergency room carrying the same bruises and the same hollow stare Evelyn carried that night. Hans didn't move to act out of heroism. He didn't need headlines, didn't need a stage. He wasn't seeking justice for honor or revenge. He acted because if he didn't, everything he had once fought to protect, truth, dignity, responsibility, would become nothing more than empty words mouthed by a man who once believed the system could fix itself from within. And now that the truth was out, Hans didn't need to shout, didn't need to slam fists or curse anyone. He just needed to step forward. Back straight, eyes open, no lies on his tongue, no weapon in hand, but hands strong enough to catch what would fall when the system finally cracked open. The layers of trauma weren't in the blood, they were in the way a man has to brace himself not to fall. When he knows, from this moment forward, he no longer has the right to stand still. Hans chose correctly, not to scream, not to kneel, not to hide behind things I still need to protect. He stood in the middle of it, even if no one else stood with him. 36 hours after the recording was transmitted to the federal system, a shortened version, 2 minutes and 46 seconds, appeared on an anonymous video sharing platform. No clickbait title, no emotional caption, just a link with a brief description. Hear what the people protecting you say when they think no one's listening. Within 3 hours, it had been shared over 10,000 times. By the 7th hour, Watchdog forums re-uploaded it with audio waveform analysis, confirming the voices were those of Brenner and Keel, two names previously mentioned in civil complaints but always set aside due to lack of evidence. When a group of independent reporters from the East Coast matched the timeline, location, recording device, and encryption log, the story exploded. The recording spread like wildfire. Within 11 hours, it hit 1 million plays. Major media platforms began reporting under a single headline: "What Police Say When They Think You're Not Listening." National television aired the subtitled segment, beginning with Brenner's smooth, composed, yet chilling voice. Evelyn was number 12. Young black, had an attitude, easy target. We handled it before the press smelled it. Then came Keel, steady and unapologetic. This city runs on silence. You speak, you're cut. You stay quiet, you're protected. Evening talk shows changed topics last minute. Experts debated the culture of silence with enforcement agencies. A restorative justice scholar called it the most dangerous recording in America since Ferguson. Teacher unions, parent groups, veterans, students, people of color, independent lawyers all began sharing the clip. No spin, no lengthy comments, just questions, cold and heavy as hammers. If this recording didn't exist, what would have happened? How many like Evelyn were never recorded? Does justice exist without evidence outside the system? By dawn, justice for Evelyn was trending nationwide. Photos of Evelyn before the incident were widely shared, not to evoke pity, but as a declaration. This is who they called a threat. Her high school was surrounded by reporters. Classmates posted entries from her old journals. "I don't know why people look at me that way." One student wrote, "We won't stay quiet like the adults did." The public anger evolved into demands. Citizens wrote letters to the mayor. Attorneys filed petitions for federal investigation. Police departments in other states declared they'd support full probes if signs of abuse emerge. But amid the uproar, one voice remained silent, or rather spoke volumes by saying nothing at all. Chief Whitaker, dubbed the face of Oak Ridge law enforcement, refused interview. He stayed off media, and with every passing hour his silence only added fuel to a fire he could no longer contain. What began as a confession behind closed doors had now become a siren exposing how an entire system functioned, through silence, concealment, and removal of inconvenience. But this time, no one cut the feed before the country could listen. At an emergency press conference, Chief Whitaker, once hailed by media as the face of Midwestern justice, stepped up to the podium. Same gray suit, same rimless glasses, hair slicked neatly, but his eyes were no longer calm. And when he spoke, the first thing people sensed wasn't composure, it was over-preparation, almost mechanical. "We're evaluating the authenticity of the recording." That was his opening line. No condolences, no mention of the victim, no acknowledgement of the community's outrage. The second sentence, "If any misconduct is found, we will act in accordance with procedure." The word procedure was repeated 3 times in the first 5 minutes. The word responsibility, never. The name Evelyn absent. The word sorry completely missing. The room remained quiet, not out of respect, but because everyone was waiting to see whether the man once considered a symbol of order, safety, and ethics would crack when the very values he represented betrayed him. Whitaker kept reading, voice monotone, like reciting a budget report. "All personnel are trained according to federal standards. Any deviation, if proven, will be reviewed through internal disciplinary channels." Not once did he look up from the page, as if dozens of cameras weren't staring him down. A young reporter stood, hand raised. "Were you aware of this group of officers? Those in the recording?" Whitaker glanced up briefly. "We have rotating joint patrol units, no fixed teams as described." Another asked, "Does Evelyn Carter, a 17-year-old girl beaten in the street, fit your definition of a technical error?" He paused, eyes on his paper. "We have yet to determine if excessive force was used at this time." A murmur spread across the room. Then, a louder one. Finally, someone near the back muttered, "Jesus Christ," and no one silenced it. In that moment, the air thickened, not a press conference anymore, but a public unmasking. People didn't need more proof. They had just witnessed something even heavier than a confession, the cold denial of humanity in a moment that demanded compassion. Meanwhile, the 2 officers at the center of the scandal, Brenner and Keel, were placed on administrative leave pending internal review, not for what they said, but for damaging the department's image. They weren't charged, not detained, not isolated from the system, just removed from the spotlight, as if the problem wasn't what they did, but how loud it got. Outside, Evelyn's school remained surrounded by media, but the students no longer dodged cameras. A group stood at the gates, holding a sign. "Evelyn was my friend, not a statistic." At the hospital hallway, her attending physician began receiving emails from former patients, thanking them for caring for someone the system called trouble. In local cafes, the story of the face of the law no longer belonged to Evelyn alone. Everyone had a story. Everyone had once been threatened, ignored, profiled, then told it was just a mistake. Online, one video was shared more than any other, a black student standing in the school courtyard, staring into the camera. If the system has to silence people like me to keep existing, then it's already dead. It's just living on borrowed voices it hasn't killed yet. That press conference didn't save Whitaker. It didn't save his department, and it didn't erase the recording. It did only one thing: show the nation that when the face of law reveals itself as a numb, unblinking mask, the only voices worth trusting are the ones it tried to erase. The small room inside the safe house was now quiet. No more alerts, no cameras, no map covered in red markers. All the equipment had been folded up and stored as if the battle was over, at least the visible part. Only two people remained: father and daughter, sitting across from each other at an old wooden table faded by time. The yellow light overhead cast a soft glow on the table, not too bright, just enough to see clearly and to respect the silence. Hans placed a small tin box on the table. Nothing fancy, no golden lock, no ornate emblem. A worn box, a few dents along the edges, preserved through years of moving, unpacking, repacking. He said nothing, no introduction, no explanation, just slid it gently toward Evelyn and withdrew his hand, resting it on his lap, as if afraid that holding it too long might misrepresent what was inside. Evelyn looked at the box. Her hand rested calmly on the table, not out of hesitation, but because she understood, instinctively, that what lay inside was not a gift, not comfort. It was something passed on, heavy enough that only someone who had stood back up from pain could carry it. She opened the lid, a soft sound, metal against metal, long kept quiet. Inside, a round brass coin, tarnished with age, engraved with the seal emblem: eagle, anchor, pistol, all facing forward, the symbol of the unit her father had served with for 18 years. It once lay over his heart for nearly 2 decades. It wasn't shiny, it wasn't polished. One edge was chipped, but its weight was intact, perhaps heavier now in the hand of someone without a uniform. Evelyn didn't ask, but she looked up, waiting for the words she knew she needed to understand. Hans looked at her, not as a protector this time, but as someone who had learned the hardest thing: to believe his child no longer needed shielding. "I kept it the entire time I was deployed," Hans said, his voice low and even, not rehearsed, just reaching back through memory. "The man who gave it to me said not to show off, but to remember what you've survived and who you survived it for." Evelyn didn't lift the coin yet. Her hand stayed beside it, not from doubt, but because touching it might mean carrying its entire history, and that history was still a weight too raw for her healing chest. But Hans didn't push. He went on, not asking for a reaction. "I'm not giving this to you because I want you to be stronger. I'm giving it to you because I know you already are. I just want you to keep it, so that if anyone ever calls you a victim, you can look at it and remember. You didn't survive because they let you. You survived because you refused to fall." A long silence, no interruptions. Evelyn looked down at the emblem, seeing not just a coin, but the nights she cried into her pillow, trying to muffle the sound, the days she returned to school, walking hallways without avoiding eyes, the first moment she drove again, even as her hands trembled. She didn't cry, but her eyes, strangely still, lingered long on that small object, as if it reflected everything she'd endured and gave her something back she hadn't dared claim until now: that she wasn't weak, not because she hadn't been broken, but because she stood up again, without needing to be led. Finally she nodded, quietly, no words, no thank you, no dad, just a single, sharp nod, the way a soldier affirms their orders before walking into a battle of their own. Vance didn't need more, because he knew in that nod, not the coin, lay the real inheritance, not passed through blood but through resolve. Hans rose from the table and walked slowly toward the door. No rush, no farewell. His shadow stretched across the room beneath the ceiling light, resembling a soldier stepping back from his final post. But this wasn't a retreat. This was the first time he let go, not in surrender, but in trust, that Evelyn could now stand on her own. Behind him, Evelyn remained seated. Her fingers gently rested on the seal coin, not gripping it, not treating it like treasure, just touching it, as if to ask, is this real? Is this weight meant for me? And if it is, am I ready? She didn't pin it to her shirt, didn't press it to her chest, but her gaze locked onto the symbol, eagle, anchor, pistol wings, as if reading a language her blood somehow understood, even without training. Then she spoke, voice calm, neither defiant nor soft, but unmistakably clear. I'm not a soldier, she said. I don't need to become a SEAL, but I promise I will never let anyone define me by what they did to me. The sentence, short, plain, split the air in the room. Hans paused, one hand on the door. He didn't turn right away, closed his eyes for a few seconds, just long enough to recognize what had happened. The burden he'd carried these past weeks, the guilt of not being there that night. The shame of a retired soldier who thought he failed to protect his family and his own country, it lifted. No one saw him cry, but anyone watching closely would have seen his shoulders lower slightly, like someone had just lifted a stone off his back. He turned. The light caught half his face, and for the first time in months, there was a smile. Small, not radiant, but real. Not because everything was over, but because he knew now he wasn't the only one carrying it anymore. Someone else, younger, bruised beyond what a 17-year-old should carry, was still there, sitting up, steady, speaking what he'd once hoped she'd find the strength to say herself. Hans said nothing more. He didn't need to. Evelyn had spoken for them both. He simply stepped forward, placed a hand gently on her shoulder, not as encouragement but as quiet confirmation. From now on, I don't walk ahead of you. I'll walk beside you, if and when you need. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, didn't speak. But her hand never left the coin. She didn't wear it, didn't leave it behind, just kept holding it as a quiet reminder. I'm not a soldier, but I have a reason not to break. Strength isn't just fists, or tactical plans, or years in uniform. True strength is when a father has the courage not to pull his daughter into his arms, but to take a step back and see her not as a child to protect, but as someone who's learned to rise on her own. And that coin, by night's end, was no longer a military emblem. It was legacy, passed not through blood, but through will. A silent promise, you will never believe you're defeated, not even when the whole world tries to convince you otherwise. Ramirez was discovered on a morning without warning. No summons, no sirens, just silence. When he walked into the locker room at the station, every eye went still. Two colleagues who'd shaken his hand just last week didn't nod anymore. One quietly left, the other slowly shut his locker and whispered, That night, Ramirez didn't go home. He left his phone behind, wiped all its data, and walked 3 neighborhoods over to an abandoned shipping yard, a place Hans had once marked on a map as a fallback point in emergencies. When Hans arrived, Ramirez was sitting atop a rusted container, face calm, but his hands still lightly trembling. I didn't leak anything, he said, voice tight, like something was lodged in his throat. I just asked one question, the wrong one, and the wrong person heard. Hans didn't blame him, didn't ask for details. He sat down beside him, eyes scanning the empty lot like reading terrain again. How much time? He asked. Ramirez gave a short, bitter laugh. I think less than 48 hours. They won't prosecute me publicly, but I don't believe I'll walk out of the department whole either. Hans nodded slightly. No panic, no outrage, but something surged in his eyes. Not fear, but responsibility. He never let someone walk with him only to be left behind, especially someone who had the courage to betray his own institution for a sliver of truth. And he knew better than anyone, when truth begins to leak, the system won't silence everyone. It picks the weakest the most alone, and makes them an example. The next day, a trade was made. On the FBI's internal system, a confidential data file was sent directly to the Federal Civilian Oversight Board, bypassing the department, skipping all internal channels. Inside, the name of a senior officer linked to at least 3 documented cover-ups, a name Hans had withheld, knowing that releasing it would force the entire operation into the light, and Evelyn would once again be dragged into public dissection. But now he had no choice. The price of saving Ramirez wasn't money. It wasn't a punch. It was surrendering control, accepting that from this moment on, the story no longer belonged to them alone. It would be taken by the system, dissected, interpreted, and sometimes twisted. Ramirez was officially reassigned, not disciplined, but he knew what that meant. The system was pushing him out without admitting it. He didn't return to the station, but he didn't leave the city either. He stayed, quietly continued feeding intel to the federal investigators, but from now on he had no name, no personnel record, just a shadow in the data. Hans watched the file upload, fingers still on the keyboard, eyes locked to the screen. No hesitation, but he knew there is no justice without cost, and sometimes that cost isn't blood, it's the truth, once in your hands, now slipping beyond your control. Monday morning. The sky wasn't exactly blue, but it was bright enough to see everything clearly. Evelyn held the keys and stepped out the door. No calls, no message left behind. Her father's silver-gray car sat quietly under the tree, the scratch near the mirror still visible, but she didn't lower her head as she approached. She opened the door, got in, fastened her seatbelt, her hands on the wheel, steady. The key turned. Firm, she drove out of the old warehouse district, turned the corner, past the street that once haunted her, no one beside her, no one watching from afar, no cameras, no warnings, just a girl, calm, grounded, driving her own car through the place that once shattered her. Near the school gates, a few students looked her way. She didn't look down. She didn't nod. She simply braked, turned off the engine, stepped out, without lowering her gaze. No one called her a victim now. No one whispered behind her back, and most importantly, no one could scare her anymore. Now, no one can hurt me. Evelyn's story has come to an end. But if it made you pause, even for a moment, if it stirred something in you, if it reminded you of someone or made you reflect on the quiet strength it takes to stand back up after being broken, then don't keep that feeling to yourself. Share it. Let it live beyond the screen. And if stories like this matter to you, stories that are raw, real, brave, and unfiltered, make sure to subscribe. There's more to come. More voices worth hearing. More truths worth telling.